That night, inside the grand hall of one of the most extravagant buildings in Las Vegas, hundreds of the city's most powerful faces were looking up at the stage. The lights shifted color without warning. No one understood why. But the woman standing center stage did the moment she looked down at her own hands. The makeup on her skin glowed unnaturally under the UV light, revealing lines and boundaries that no amount of money could erase. A secret that an entire empire had spent years burying was suddenly laid bare before the entire world. From the VIP row, a man rushed onto the stage. He pulled off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders, gripping her arm, pulling her away. But she didn't move. She pushed his hand away, gently but firmly. She didn't run. For the first time in her life, she didn't run. And this story, it didn't begin in that moment. It began in a small bakery, on a street that no one remembers the name of anymore. There, a woman lost everything. And the last words she spoke before she was pushed out, no one believed. Until tonight. If this story touched you, hit like so more people can hear it. Share it with someone you think needs to hear it. And subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next story. That street had once had a name. It had once had laughter. It had once carried the smell of baked bread all the way out to the sidewalk every early morning. Hidden behind the great avenues of Las Vegas, that little street had no neon lights, no giant billboards. It had only a row of small shops standing one after another, places where the owners knew every regular customer by name. And in the middle of that street, there was a bakery. Ruth Kent's Bakery. Ruth was the kind of person who made customers feel that, once they stepped inside, they didn't need to look at the menu. She remembered what everyone liked, what everyone was allergic to, who was going through a hard season and needed a free pastry with a smile tucked beside it. The bakery wasn't large, just big enough for a few small tables, but it was rarely empty. People didn't come only because the pastries were good. They came because Ruth made them feel welcome. Marlo, Ruth's daughter, 28 years old, was the only person helping her mother at the bakery. She couldn't remember when she had first learned to knead dough, but her real passion wasn't baking. It was photography. Whenever she had free time, Marlo would stand outside on the bakery's front step, lift her old camera, and capture the small moments on the street. An old man sitting with his coffee, a child running through a puddle. Nameless faces, but full of stories. Every now and then, Ruth would look out and shake her head with a smile. She didn't understand why her daughter loved taking pictures of strangers so much. But she didn't forbid it. She only said, "You can do whatever you want, as long as you're true to yourself." Life for mother and daughter was simple that way. Open the bakery in the morning, close it at night. Not rich, not lacking. Ruth had a handwritten recipe book that she always kept on the kitchen shelf. Its pages had yellowed, and the edges were curled from so much use. In the margin beside every recipe were small notes in her own handwriting. That book wasn't only a book of recipes. But that part comes later. Everything changed one morning. The owner of the flower shop 2 doors down came knocking on the bakery door, his face pale. He said, "I just signed the sale papers. They paid 3 times the price." Ruth asked, "Who bought it?" He shook his head. "All I know is Voss Empire." That name, in Las Vegas, was known by everyone. Voss Empire, the largest real estate and entertainment corporation in the city. When they wanted something, they got it. Not with guns, not with threats. With money. With a system. With the cold patience of people who had never had to hear the word no. The first week, the grocery store at the head of the street sold. The second week, the laundromat sold. The third week, the coffee shop on the corner sold. One door after another closed. One sign after another was taken down. The street slowly emptied, like a mouth losing its teeth one by one. Only one shop remained lit, Ruth Kent's Bakery. The neighbors advised her to sell. It was a great deal of money, and life would be easier to breathe through. Ruth shook her head. "This bakery isn't merchandise. This bakery is home." Marlo stood in the kitchen, hearing her mother say those words, her hands still working the dough. She didn't say anything. But she knew that when her mother used the word home for the bakery, it meant she would never leave, no matter what happened. Sterling Voss was 33 years old. In Las Vegas, people knew his name before they ever saw his face. Not because he appeared often in the papers. On the contrary, Sterling rarely appeared at all. And that was exactly what made people afraid. Powerful men who liked to show off were merely rich. Powerful men no one ever saw were the ones who were truly dangerous. Voss Empire was the largest real estate and entertainment empire in the city. Hotels, resorts, shopping centers, casinos, everything ran under one name. And behind that name, there was only one man making the decisions. Sterling never raised his voice. He spoke softly, slowly, and only once. If someone didn't hear him clearly, that was their problem, not his. In meetings, when Sterling fell silent, the whole room stopped breathing. When he opened his mouth, no one dared interrupt. His power didn't live in his fists. It lived in the system. Lawyers, banks, the media, contracts. Those four things, in Sterling's hands, were more lethal than any weapon. When the little street where Ruth's bakery stood fell onto Voss Empire's development map, Sterling didn't need to go there himself. He only needed to open the project blueprint on his desk, circle that street, and say 2 words to the team beneath him. Handle it. No further explanation was needed. No need to ask who lived there, who made a living there, who would lose what. To Sterling, that street was only a cell on a spreadsheet, a line in a plan, a small obstacle on the way to an entertainment project worth hundreds of millions of dollars. His team began working. The first step was to buy every shop around Ruth's bakery. High prices, cash, quick signatures. Most of the shop owners sold within 1 week. The second step was to cut off the supply chain. Ruth's main flour supplier suddenly informed her they would no longer deliver. No reason was given. Ruth called another supplier, and they accepted the order, then canceled at the last minute. It went on that way, until ingredients became harder and harder to get, prices rose higher and higher, and quality grew worse and worse. The third step was the media. 1-star reviews began appearing online, in waves, one after another. Nameless accounts wrote complaints so detailed they sounded as though they had been prepared in advance. The pastries weren't good. The bakery was dirty. The service was poor. Ruth read those lines with trembling hands. She knew they were fake, but new customers didn't. Business slowly began to fall. The final step was the bank. Ruth had a small loan to keep the bakery running. That loan was coming up for renewal. She filed the application the way she did every year, but this time, the bank refused. Not qualified, they said. Ruth asked why. The answer was circular, unclear, but the result was very clear. With no money, no steady ingredients, and no customers, Ruth Kent's bakery was slowly dying. No one came to threaten her. No one pounded on her door in the middle of the night. There was nothing she could call the police about. Everything was legal. Everything had paperwork. And that was the cruelest part of all. Ruth was being driven into a corner without being able to point to the person driving her there and name him. Marlo watched her mother every night, sitting at the kitchen table, turning through the recipe book, reading the old notes again, as if she were searching for some answer between those yellowed pages. But the answer wasn't there. It was on the highest floor of the Voss Empire building, where a 33-year-old man was reviewing the progress report on the new project. And that little street was only one line already crossed off the list. Ruth didn't give any warning. She went to the Voss Empire building on a Tuesday morning, wearing the cleanest outfit she owned, her hair neatly combed, her back straight. The building rose more than 40 stories high, its glass face reflecting the entire Las Vegas sky. Ruth stood before the revolving door and looked up once. Then she walked in. The grand lobby was wide and cold. The sound of her shoes echoed across the polished stone floor. The receptionist looked up, studied Ruth from head to toe, then asked if she had an appointment. Ruth said no. The receptionist shook her head and said no one was allowed up to the top floor without an appointment. Ruth stood still. She didn't shout. She didn't make trouble. She simply stood there, right in the middle of the lobby, and said very clearly, "I won't leave until the owner of this building meets with me." The receptionist picked up the phone and called upstairs. A few minutes later, she set the phone down and said, "He's agreed to see you. 10 minutes." Ruth stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. She watched the numbers move across the digital display, floor by floor, climbing higher. When the elevator doors opened on the top floor, Ruth stepped into a large room, so quiet she could hear the sound of her own footsteps. Sterling Voss stood beside his desk, holding a cup of coffee. He looked at Ruth without surprise, without irritation, as if she were an appointment that had been written on his calendar long ago. "Please sit," Sterling said, his voice soft. He poured a glass of water and placed it in front of Ruth. "What would you like to say?" Ruth didn't drink the water. She looked straight into Sterling's face. "I know you're behind all of this," Ruth said. "The ingredient suppliers, the fake reviews online, the bank refusing to renew the loan. All of it points in one direction. You want my street. You want my bakery." Sterling didn't deny it. He didn't admit it either. He only took a sip of coffee, set the cup down, and said, "Mrs. Kent, I understand that you're attached to the bakery. I respect that. But this city changes. That street will change. With or without your agreement, the result will still be the same." His voice wasn't cold. It was worse than cold. It was polite. Polite in the way of a man used to seeing everything as numbers. Used to making decisions without ever having to look into the eyes of the people affected by them. When Sterling finished speaking, he leaned back slightly, as if the conversation had ended. The 10 minutes weren't over yet, but to him, it had been over before Ruth ever walked into the room. Ruth stayed silent for a moment. She looked at the glass of water in front of her, at the wide room, at the sky through the great pane of glass behind Sterling. Then she stood. Not hurriedly, not trembling. She stood as straight as she had when she walked into the first-floor lobby. "You think you can control everything," Ruth said. Her voice not loud, but every word was clear. "You think money can buy silence. Power can buy obedience. Maybe you're right. Today, you're right." She stopped, looking at Sterling one last time. "But one day, the thing you've hidden most carefully will be exposed in front of everyone, and then you'll understand what it means to lose something you can't buy back." Sterling didn't answer. He turned his chair and looked out through the glass, his back facing Ruth, as if she were no longer there, as if she had never been there at all. Ruth left the room, the elevator doors closed. She stood alone inside the elevator, watching the numbers move backward, floor by floor, going down. She didn't cry. She didn't say anything, but her hands were clenched so tightly that her knuckles went white. Down in the lobby, Marlo was waiting. She sat on the chair near the revolving door, holding her old camera in her hands, her eyes fixed on the elevator doors. When Ruth stepped out, Marlo stood up at once. "Mom, are you okay?" Ruth looked at her daughter. Her eyes were dry. There were no tears, but her face had changed, as if something inside her had just gone out, or had just been lit. Marlo didn't know what it was, but years later, she would still remember that face clearly. The face of someone who had just finished saying the last thing she needed to say, and knew that no one believed her. The bakery closed on a Saturday. There was no sign posted, no farewell gathering. Ruth simply locked the door, stood outside on the sidewalk, looked at the sign one last time, then turned her back and walked away. Marlo stood beside her mother, holding the box with the recipe book and a few small things from the kitchen. She wanted to say something, but she couldn't find a sentence that was enough. There are moments when words become meaningless. This was one of them. But losing the bakery was only the beginning. A few weeks later, Ruth received a notice from a lawyer. She was accused of financial fraud. The bakery's accounting records had been found to contain discrepancies. The tax numbers didn't match, and several transactions had been placed in the suspicious category. Ruth read those pages with trembling hands, her eyes unable to believe what she was seeing. She was the one who kept the books by hand. Every dollar, every cent. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong, but the paperwork said otherwise, and paperwork in the hands of Voss Empire's lawyers was always right. The lawsuit didn't go to court. It didn't need to go to court. All it took was for Ruth Kent's name to appear beside the word fraud in the newspaper. Her reputation, the thing she had built for 30 years, fell apart in 3 weeks. Old regular customers didn't dare contact her. The people who had once praised her pastries as the best on the street now passed over her name without stopping. Ruth didn't defend herself. She knew who she would be defending herself to. Against the system Sterling had built, the word of a baker didn't weigh as much as a sheet of paper printed from a machine. Mother and daughter lost their home. The small house attached to the bakery, right behind the kitchen, where Marlo had once woken every morning to the smell of melting butter. That house belonged to the street. The street belonged to Voss Empire, and Voss Empire didn't let anyone stay for free. Ruth and Marlo moved to a small apartment on the outskirts, far from downtown, far from everything. Ruth tried to keep things normal. Every morning, she still woke early, even though there was no bakery left to open. She still made coffee, still sat at the kitchen table, still asked Marlo what she planned to do that day. But Marlo saw it. Her mother was getting thinner, her steps were slower, her voice was softer. Ruth was wearing down little by little, day by day, like a candle burning in a room with no wind, yet still going out. She didn't complain. She didn't blame anyone. She was simply tired. And perhaps she had been tired since the day she stepped out of the elevator in the Voss Empire building, with dry eyes and a face that had changed. The recipe book always lay at Ruth's bedside. Every night, she touched it before sleeping, as if it were the last thing still holding her to the old version of herself. 2 years passed. Ruth died one afternoon. No noise. No drama. She simply lay in bed, her eyes closed, her hand resting on the book. Marlo came home, opened the bedroom door, and knew immediately. The room was too quiet, the quiet of a place where the last person had just left. Marlo didn't scream. She didn't collapse onto the floor. She pulled a chair beside her mother's bed, held Ruth's cold hand, and sat there until the sky had gone completely dark. Ruth Kent's funeral was very small. There wasn't a long line of mourners. There weren't flowers covering everything. There was only Marlo, a few new neighbors from the outskirts, and silence. She took care of everything herself, alone. After the funeral, Marlo returned to the empty apartment. She sat on her mother's bed, looking at the recipe book lying on the pillow. She picked it up. It felt heavier than usual, or maybe her hands were weaker than usual. She meant to open it, but the moment her fingers touched the edge of the first page, she stopped, because she heard her mother's voice. Not in her head. Everywhere. In the small kitchen. In the smell of old flowers still clinging to the cover. In the emptiness between the walls. Marlo closed the book. She placed it in a drawer, and she didn't open it again. While Marlo closed the recipe book and put it away in the drawer, on the other side of the city, on the highest floor of a penthouse overlooking the entire Las Vegas skyline, another woman was also living with something she kept hidden. Kira Voss, 25 years old, Sterling's younger sister. The woman Las Vegas high society called the Princess of the Voss Empire. That evening, Sterling came to the penthouse with food. He often did that, several times a week, bringing dinner up and sitting down to eat with his sister. The two of them sat across from each other at the table. Sterling asked, "Do you need anything?" Kira shook her head. "No, I don't need anything." That answer had been repeated hundreds of times, and hundreds of times. Both of them knew it wasn't true. But no one said it out loud. No one touched the shell they had built together. Sterling ate slowly, glancing at his sister from time to time. Kira ate little, her eyes lowered to her plate more often than they lifted to him. When dinner ended, Sterling stood, put on his coat, and walked toward the door. He stopped at the threshold and looked back at Kira once more. Kira was still sitting at the table, turning the water glass in her hand. She didn't look up. Sterling closed the door behind him. The door shut softly, but inside that wide, empty penthouse, the sound seemed louder than usual. Kira sat there a while longer. Then she stood and walked into the bathroom. She stood before the mirror, turned on the faucet, and picked up a cotton pad. Layer by layer, she wiped away the foundation from her face, her neck, her arms, slowly, carefully, as if peeling off a mask she had worn all day. Beneath the makeup, her skin appeared. Patches of lost pigment scattered across her neck, spread down to her shoulders, ran along her left arm and part of her right cheek. Vitiligo. The boundary between her normal skin and the silvery white patches was as clear as lines drawn on a map. Kira looked at herself in the mirror, looked for a long time. Then she turned away and switched off the bathroom light. 3 years earlier, when Kira was 22, the first white patches appeared on her wrist. They were small, only like birthmarks, but they spread faster than anyone had expected. Sterling noticed them before Kira did. He didn't panic. He acted. Within 2 weeks, he hired a private makeup specialist and flew her in from New York. He made every employee in the penthouse sign a confidentiality agreement. He controlled every public appearance Kira made. No one was allowed to know. No one was allowed to ask. No one was allowed to speak. Kira accepted it. At the time, she thought her brother was protecting her. He cared about her. He wanted her not to be hurt. And perhaps, on some level, that was true. But that protection didn't stop at makeup. Sterling controlled Kira's schedule. She was only allowed to go out when a team had prepared everything in advance, only allowed to meet people who had already been approved. only allowed to appear in places where the lighting, the camera angles, and every detail were within control. Once, Kira told Sterling she wanted to study fashion design. She loved drawing, loved fabric, loved the way a piece of clothing could change how people looked at one another. Sterling shook his head. "You don't need to worry about that. I can take care of everything." Kira didn't argue. She never argued with Sterling. But in the drawer of her bedroom desk, beneath several old magazines, there was a stack of papers, pencil sketches of clothing designs. Kira drew them at night, when no one was watching. She hid them there, as if hiding a part of her true self that no one allowed her to live. Time passed, and Kira slowly grew used to that life. Having everything served to her, being told she was beautiful every day, being treated like a perfect work of art. And little by little, she began to believe it. She became arrogant. If an employee brought her coffee 2 minutes late, she frowned. If a maid folded the towels the wrong way, she didn't even bother to look. Once, when a new assistant accidentally looked at Kira longer than usual, Kira asked coldly, "What are you looking at?" The girl apologized in a panic. Kira didn't answer. The perfect image Sterling had built for Kira had slowly become her real self. Or at least, the self she believed was real. Outside, she was the flawless princess. Inside, every night, she still stood before the bathroom mirror, wiped off her makeup, looked at the blotched patches of skin, and then turned off the light. Every day was the same. Turn off the light, then go to sleep. As if, by not seeing it, it didn't exist. 3 years had passed since the day Ruth died. For 3 years, Marlo had lived alone. She left the apartment on the outskirts and moved into a place even smaller, a little closer to downtown, close enough for her to take jobs without spending too much money on gas. Marlo worked as a freelance photographer. Portraits. It was the only thing she was good at besides baking, and baking was something she no longer touched. Marlo's photography style was different from most photographers in Las Vegas. She didn't retouch, didn't use Photoshop, didn't smooth skin, didn't enlarge eyes, didn't adjust colors to make them prettier than reality. She photographed people exactly as they were. Every wrinkle, every scar, every patch of freckles. She called them honest portraits. A few small magazines liked that style. They hired her to shoot interviews, features, and, now and then, events. Enough for Marlo to have a name in the field. Not enough for her to live comfortably. Every month was a calculation. Rent, electricity, camera maintenance. Some months, she had to choose between buying a new lens and eating enough dinners. She chose the lens. One afternoon, she received a call from an intermediary. The voice was polite, professional, and straight to the point. There was a portrait contract for a member of the Voss family, a personal image project, filmed and photographed at a private residence. The fee was higher than any contract Marlo had ever accepted. The intermediary didn't give the specific name of the person who needed the shoot, only said it was a private contract and required a confidentiality agreement before the work began. Marlo listened, then fell silent for a few seconds. Voss. That name wasn't unfamiliar to her. It had never been unfamiliar. It had been in her mind for 3 years, like a stone sunk at the bottom of the water. Something she didn't want to look at but always knew was there. She knew what Voss Empire was. She knew who Sterling Voss was. She knew what that empire had been built on. And one part of it was her mother's bakery. But next month's rent still hadn't been paid. Her camera needed a new battery. And this contract paid 5 times what she earned in a normal month. Marlo accepted the job. She thought it would be a shoot for some company event, or for internal materials. She didn't think she would have to step into the Voss family's private home. On the first day, she arrived at the address sent to her by text message, a penthouse at the top of one of the tallest buildings in Las Vegas. She stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the highest floor, and watched the numbers climb, just as her mother once had, in that same elevator, many years before. When the elevator doors opened, an assistant led her down a short hallway, then opened a large door, and there, in the middle of a wide living room flooded with natural light, a young woman was sitting, beautiful, perfectly made up, her back straight, her chin slightly raised, her eyes looking at Marlo with the indifference of someone used to being served. Kira Voss. Marlo recognized her at once, not because she knew Kira's face, but because she recognized this penthouse, this building, the Voss name on the contract. She was standing inside the home of the people who had taken everything from her mother. Marlowe's hand tightened around the strap of her camera bag. She stood in the doorway, not stepping in, not stepping back. A few seconds. Only a few seconds. But in those few seconds, she saw everything at once. A room 10 times larger than the apartment she was renting. Light pouring through floor-to-ceiling glass. The woman seated in the middle of the room, waiting to be served. And behind all of it, a name she would never forget. She could turn away. Step back into the elevator. Go down to the lobby. Go home. Return the contract. Keep her self-respect. But then what? It would still be the cramped apartment, still the nights spent counting every dollar, still the recipe book lying silent in the drawer, the one she didn't dare open. Marlowe stepped in, not because she forgave, not because she forgot. She stepped in because she needed to live. And because a small part of her, the part she didn't want to admit existed. I wanted to see with her own eyes the world behind this door, the world her mother had once stood outside looking into, only to be pushed away. The first shoot wasn't easy. Kira sat in front of the lens as if she were sitting on a throne. She didn't smile, didn't say hello, didn't ask Marlowe's name. She only asked one question. How long will this take? Marlowe answered, about 2 hours. Kira frowned. Can you make it faster? I have other things to do. Marlowe said nothing. She opened her camera bag, attached the lens, adjusted the lights, and began. Kira gave orders constantly. That angle won't work. The light needs to be softer. Don't shoot from the right side. I don't like the right side. Marlowe listened, adjusted, and didn't react. She had met enough kinds of clients in her profession to know that arguing didn't help, especially not with the person paying her. The shoot ended. Kira stood and walked away without saying another word. Marlowe packed up her things alone in the wide, silent room. The second shoot was the same. The third was the same. Kira was haughty. Marlowe was quiet. The two of them were in the same room, but they were separated like two walls. But over many sessions, something began to change. Not loudly, not clearly. Only the silences between them began to feel a little less heavy. Kira started to talk. Not give orders. Really talk. At first, they were only small, harmless sentences. It's too hot today. I couldn't sleep last night. The coffee here is terrible. Marlowe answered briefly, without forcing it. And perhaps it was precisely because she didn't try to become close, didn't flatter, didn't fawn, that Kira felt something rare in her life. Being beside someone who wanted nothing from her. In this penthouse, everyone wanted something from Kira. The employees wanted to keep their jobs. The assistants wanted their salaries. Guests wanted a connection to Sterling through her. Everyone had a purpose. Marlowe didn't. She came, took photographs, packed up, and left. And that healthy indifference became the very thing that made Kira lower her guard. One afternoon, while Marlowe was adjusting the angle of a light, Kira suddenly said, "Sometimes I look in the mirror and don't know who the person in it is." Marlowe's hand stopped. She didn't turn to look at Kira. She stood still, her hand still on the light stand, and remained silent. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because that sentence touched a wound she carried too. She too had once stood before a mirror, after her mother died, and failed to recognize herself. She understood that feeling, but she didn't say it. She only continued adjusting the light, then said softly, "Are you ready? Let's keep shooting." Kira nodded. No one mentioned that sentence again, but from that day on, the distance between them shortened a little more. A few weeks later, during a midday shoot, something happened. That day was hotter than usual. The air conditioning system in the shooting room had a problem, and it took a while to fix. The studio lights gave off heat. Kira sat beneath them, and beads of sweat began to appear on her forehead, on her neck. She brushed lightly at them with her hand, and Marlowe saw it. In the place Kira had just wiped, the foundation smudged, revealing a silvery white patch of skin on her neck. The boundary between the normal skin and the depigmented area was clear, sharp, unmistakable. Kira didn't know yet. She was still looking into the lens. But when she saw Marlowe's eyes change, she lowered her hand, touched her neck, and found the exposed skin. Kira's face changed color. Not from shame, from fear. Pure, raw fear, like an animal driven into a corner. She sprang to her feet, stepped back, and stared at Marlowe as if looking at a threat. Her hand trembled. She was about to turn and run out of the room. Marlowe said, Stay still. Kira stopped, not because she wanted to, but because Marlowe's voice was too calm, too steady. There was no panic, no shock, no disgust, only calm. I'm not taking the picture, Marlowe continued, looking straight at Kira. But don't run either. Kira stood in the middle of the room, her hand still on her neck, covering the exposed skin. Her eyes were red, but she didn't cry, and she didn't run. It was the first time in 3 years that someone had seen Kira without her makeup fully covering her, and that person didn't turn away, didn't show fear, didn't call Sterling, didn't report it to anyone. She only stood there, calm, and told her not to run. Marlowe placed the camera on the table. She took a bottle of water from her bag and set it on the table beside Kira. Then she turned back to pack up the lights, as if nothing had happened. In the quiet room, Kira slowly lowered her hand from her neck. She sat back down in the chair, and for the first time, she breathed out as if a burden she had carried for far too long had finally been set down. Sterling noticed something was different on a Wednesday morning. That day, the makeup team came to the penthouse as usual, but Kira refused. She said she didn't need it today. I'm staying home. I'm not going out. I don't need makeup. The head of the makeup team called the manager. The manager called Sterling. Sterling listened, stayed silent for 3 seconds, then said, "Fine." Let her take 1 session off, but he didn't forget. A few days later, Kira asked for something else. She wanted to go out alone, without an assistant with her. Just for a walk, she said. I'm not going far. Sterling didn't agree. But what caught his attention wasn't the request. It was the way Kira said it. Her voice was different, not the voice of someone making a demand. It was the voice of someone testing whether she had the right to make one. Sterling knew his sister. He knew every small change on her face, every slight movement in her behavior. And he knew that when Kira began to change, it meant someone had touched the shell he had built around her. He called the manager and asked who had been in contact with Kira recently, besides the regular staff. There was only one answer. The photographer, the girl taking portraits. Her name was Marlowe Kent. Sterling ordered an investigation. Within 1 day, Marlowe's file was on his desk. Photographs, address, work history, bank account, and one small line at the bottom of the page, daughter of Ruth Kent. Sterling read that line twice. Ruth Kent, a name he didn't remember until he saw it on paper. He leaned back in his chair, looking at the file, and for the first time in a very long while, he didn't know what he was feeling. Not fear. Sterling wasn't afraid. It was something harder to name, like walking down a familiar road and suddenly realizing the ground beneath your feet wasn't as solid as you thought. He summoned Marlowe to his office. That afternoon, Marlowe stepped into the room on the highest floor of the Voss Empire building. It was the second time in her life she had stood in that room. The first time, her mother had walked in. This time, it was her turn. Sterling sat behind the desk, Marlowe's file open in front of him. He didn't invite her to sit. Didn't pour water. He only looked at her in silence, as if measuring something the naked eye couldn't see. You know what's wrong with my sister, Sterling said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Marlowe didn't deny it. I know. How long? A few weeks. Who else knows? No one. Just me. Sterling opened a drawer and took out an envelope. He pushed it across the desk toward Marlowe. There's a number in here, Sterling said. Enough for you to live comfortably for a few years. Take it. Sign the confidentiality agreement, and leave Las Vegas. We'll never see each other again. Marlowe looked at the envelope. She didn't touch it. No. Sterling tilted his head. That wasn't an answer he was used to hearing. In Sterling's world, money solved everything. People only differed in the number that made them nod. But Marlowe didn't nod. She looked straight into Sterling's eyes and said, I came here because I needed rent money. But now I'm standing here because you took everything from my mother. And you don't even remember her name. Sterling was silent. Not the silence of a man thinking of an answer. It was the silence of someone who had just been touched in a place he didn't know still existed. He looked at Marlowe. Looked for a long time. Not angry. Not threatening. Only looking, as if looking at an equation he couldn't solve. A person who couldn't be bought. A variable outside his system. Then he said, his voice low and even, You're fired. From now on, you're not allowed near my sister. If you say anything to anyone, I'll make sure no magazine, no company, No one in this city ever hires you to take a single photograph again." Marlo stood. She said nothing more. There was nothing more that needed saying. She turned her back, walked to the door, and left. The envelope of money remained on the desk, untouched. The room was empty again. Sterling sat alone. He looked at the envelope for a while, then pushed it aside. He opened his computer, typed a name into the internal records search bar. Ruth Kent. The results appeared. Old file, bakery, loan, reviews, financial fraud case. Everything contained neatly within a few pages of documents. Sterling skimmed through them. Then he closed the computer. His face showed no expression. But that night, he couldn't sleep. Marlo got back to her apartment after dark. She closed the door and didn't turn on the lights. She stood in the darkness for a while, still holding her camera bag, her back leaning against the door. She felt tired, not the kind of tired that came from walking too much or working too hard. It was the kind of tired that came from trying for too long without knowing what you were trying for anymore. 3 years. For 3 years, she had lived in this city, the city that had swallowed her mother, swallowed the bakery, swallowed everything. For 3 years, she had kept her head down and worked, taken photographs, accepted money, paid rent, then taken photographs again, only to end up standing in the office of the very man who had taken everything, thrown out like a number crossed off a spreadsheet. She turned on the kitchen light. The weak yellow glow fell over the small kitchen. Her eyes found the drawer beside the sink, the drawer where she kept her mother's recipe book. She didn't know why she did it. Maybe because she was angry. Maybe because she felt helpless. Maybe because she needed to pour the feeling choking her chest into something, anything. She opened the drawer, took out the book, and threw it into the trash can. The book fell to the bottom, lying between a lunch container and several advertising flyers. Marlo didn't look back. She sat down on the kitchen floor, her back against the lower cabinet, her knees drawn up. She sat there, staring at the ceiling, and thought about leaving Las Vegas, leaving all of it, going to another city, somewhere no one knew her name, no one knew her mother's name, no one knew what Voss Empire was, starting over, or at least running away and being done with it. She thought about it very seriously. She even thought that tomorrow morning she would pack her things, call a car, and go to the airport. Anywhere would do, as long as it wasn't here. She sat on the kitchen floor until her legs went numb. Then she stood, went into the bedroom, and lay down on the bed, closed her eyes. She couldn't sleep. She turned over, lay on her back, lay on her side, closed her eyes, opened them. The ceiling was dark and empty. The air conditioner hummed steadily. Cars passed outside now and then, one at a time. Then silence returned. She thought of Kira. She thought of Kira's eyes when the makeup smudged, the pure terror in that gaze. She thought of Sterling, the way he pushed the envelope of money across the desk, as if he were paying a bill. She thought of her mother standing in the first-floor lobby, waiting for her face dry, but changed. And she thought of the book, lying in the trash can, between a lunch container and advertising flyers. Marlo opened her eyes. She lay still a while longer. Then she got up, walked out to the kitchen, opened the lid of the trash can. The book was there, the edge of its cover stained with a streak of sauce from the lunch container. She picked it up, gently, as if holding something she had nearly lost. She took a cloth and wiped the stain from the cover, wiped every corner, every edge. Then she opened it. The first page, her mother's handwriting. The letters slightly slanted, slightly hurried, as though she was always busy doing something in the kitchen but still trying to write it down. The first pastry we ever made together. Marlo read that line, then read it again. She couldn't hold back. The tears fell before she even understood that she was crying. She cried without making a sound, standing in the middle of the kitchen, holding the book, her tears falling onto the yellowed page. She cried for the first time since the day her mother died. For 3 years, she hadn't cried. For 3 years, she had pressed everything down, held it tight, locked it away, hidden it. But tonight, alone in the small kitchen, she couldn't hold it in anymore. She cried until there were no tears left. Then she wiped her face, closed the book, and placed it on the kitchen table. Not in the drawer, on the kitchen table, right in the middle, right in front of her, where it would be the first thing she saw every morning when she woke up. Marlo didn't leave Las Vegas. 2 days later, One afternoon, there was a knock on Marlowe's apartment door. Soft, hesitant, not like the knock of a delivery person or a neighbor. Marlowe opened the door, and standing there, in the narrow hallway, beneath the pale fluorescent light shining down from the ceiling, was Kira Voss. No makeup, no assistant, no bodyguard, no one with her, only Kira, in a loose coat, her hand gripping the strap of her handbag, her face fully revealing the depigmented patches on her cheek, on her neck. She looked much smaller than she had while sitting in the penthouse. Smaller, more real, and more afraid. Marlowe said nothing. She looked at Kira and waited. Kira swallowed. Then she spoke, her voice small, slightly trembling. "You're the only person who saw me and didn't turn away." Marlowe stood in the doorway a while longer. She looked at Kira, at the uncovered face, at the eyes trying to stay calm but unable to hide their unease. And she thought of her mother, thought of what her mother had once said. "You can do whatever you want, as long as you're true to yourself." Marlowe opened the door wider. "Come in." Kira stepped into the apartment. She didn't look around, didn't make any comment. She only followed Marlowe into the kitchen, where the afternoon light slipped through the small window, and the recipe book lay on the kitchen table, exactly where Marlowe had placed it 2 nights before. Marlowe looked at the book, then at Kira. She didn't know why she was doing this. Maybe because Kira had come here alone, without makeup, without weapons, with nothing but the truth on her face. Maybe because Marlowe recognized that she and Kira, though they stood on completely opposite sides, were both carrying wounds caused by the same person. Or maybe, simply, because Marlowe needed to bake. She picked up the book and opened it. For the second time since the night she had pulled it out of the trash. Her hand turned past the first page, past her mother's handwritten line that she had read through tears. She turned to a recipe in the middle of the book. Butter sugar cookies. The simplest of all the recipes. The kind of pastry Ruth often made on ordinary days, with no special occasion at all, only because she loved the smell of butter melting in the oven. Marlowe said nothing. She took flour, butter, and sugar from the kitchen cabinet. She began to mix. Kira sat on the small chair beside the table, both hands resting on her lap, her back straight out of habit, but her eyes never leaving Marlowe. She watched Marlowe knead the dough, watched her hands press down, fold over, press down, fold over. Rhythmic, steady, like a ritual. No one said anything. The small kitchen, the sound of dough hitting the counter, the soft click of the oven as it began to heat, the clock on the wall moving second by second. No music. No conversation. Only 2 women in a cramped kitchen, and the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was light. Light. As if both of them understood that some things didn't need to be spoken aloud in order to exist. Marlowe put the cookies into the oven. Then she sat down across from Kira. The 2 of them waited. The smell of butter began to spread. Slowly, warmly, slipping into every corner of the kitchen. Marlowe hadn't smelled that scent in 3 years. The smell of Ruth's bakery. The smell of her mother. The smell of before everything was taken away. Marlowe breathed in. She didn't cry. She had cried enough. She only breathed in, held that scent in her chest for a moment, then let it out. Kira smelled it too. She breathed in lightly, her eyes closing a little. She had never smelled anything like that in the penthouse. In the penthouse, everything smelled of perfume, scented wax, of perfection arranged into place. This smell was different. This smell was real. When the cookies were done, Marlowe took them out and set them on the table. The 2 of them ate in silence. The cookies were simple. Butter, sugar, flour, nothing special. But Kira ate slowly, in small bites, as if tasting something she had been missing for a long time without knowing its name. When the plate was nearly empty, Kira lowered her hand to her handbag. She took out a stack of papers, folded in half, slightly wrinkled at the corner. She placed them on the table between them. Fashion design sketches, pencil on white paper, free lines, following no pattern, but alive with feeling. Kira looked at the drawings, then at Marlowe. "I want to start over," Kira said, her voice small. "But I don't know where to start." Marlowe looked at the drawings on the table. She didn't praise them, didn't analyze them. She looked at them the way one looks at something someone has hidden for far too long. Then she looked up at Kira. "Start from where you're standing." Kira didn't answer right away. She looked at Marlowe, then down at the plate of cookies, then at the recipe book still open on the kitchen table. She nodded. Just a little, but enough. Outside, the sky began to darken. The light in the kitchen shifted from afternoon gold to lamplight gold. The smell of cookies still lingered. And the two women remained sitting there, in the small kitchen, saying nothing more. Sometimes, healing doesn't begin with words. It begins with a butter-sugar cookie, an old book, and one person willing to sit beside you without turning away. Kira came back to Marlowe's apartment. Not once, many times. The second time, she came in the morning, bringing coffee. The third time, she came in the afternoon and sat in the kitchen, watching Marlowe organize photographs on her computer. The fourth time, she came without needing a reason. She only knocked. Marlowe opened the door. Kira stepped inside and sat down. Like a new habit neither of them had named. Every time she came, Kira wore no makeup. She left the penthouse secretly, without telling anyone, without letting Sterling's team know. She wore ordinary clothes, put on a hat, and walked out of the building through the side entrance. Every time she stepped onto the street, her heart beat fast, but every time, she still went. In Marlowe's small kitchen, the two of them talked more. Not about big things, small things. Kira said she liked drawing at night, liked the smell of black coffee but couldn't drink it because it was bitter, liked listening to old music when she didn't know the names of the songs. Marlowe told her about once photographing an old woman selling flowers on the roadside, the most beautiful photograph she had ever taken, but one she never posted anywhere because she felt it was too private to share. Small stories. But for two women, one who had lived inside a shell for too long, and one who had lived in silence for too long, those small stories were a great deal. One afternoon, Kira was sitting there, watching Marlowe adjust a portrait on her computer. The photograph was of an older man, his face full of wrinkles, his eyes looking straight into the lens. Marlowe didn't change anything, didn't smooth the skin, didn't erase the wrinkles, didn't adjust the light to make it more beautiful. She only cropped the frame, then saved it. Kira looked at the photograph for a while, then asked, "Why do you shoot this way?" "What way?" "The way you don't retouch anything. The real face, the real wrinkles, everything left as it is. Why?" Marlowe turned off the screen and turned her chair to look at Kira. She was silent for a moment, as if weighing how much she should say. Then she said, "Because of my mother." Kira didn't interrupt. She sat still and waited. "My mother had a bakery," Marlowe said, her voice even and slow. "Just a small one, on a street no one remembers the name of anymore. She made pastries by hand and wrote her recipes in an old book. She wasn't rich, wasn't famous, wasn't special in the way this world measures things. But she was real. Everything about her was real. The way she kneaded dough, the way she remembered every regular customer's name, the way she smiled when someone said the pastries were good. None of it was fake." Kira listened, her eyes lowered to her hands. Marlowe went on. "My mother used to say, only what's real can last. She believed that. She lived by that. And then she lost everything. The bakery, the house, her reputation, all of it. Because someone more powerful than her decided that her life wasn't worth as much as a real estate project." Marlowe stopped. She didn't say Sterling's name, didn't say Voss Empire, didn't point to anyone. She only told the truth, exactly the way her mother had once lived. Real. Nothing added, nothing taken away. "So I photograph real faces," Marlowe said. "Because that's the only thing my mother left me. Not money, not a house, but the way to live truthfully. I photograph people exactly as they are, because I believe what my mother believed. Only what's real is worth keeping." The kitchen was silent. Kira said nothing. She sat there, her eyes still lowered to her hands, two fingers twisting together. She didn't ask more. Didn't ask who that powerful person was. Didn't ask exactly what had happened. Maybe because she didn't need to ask. Maybe, deep inside, she had known the answer before Marlowe ever opened her mouth. She simply hadn't been ready to hear it. Kira left Marlowe's apartment when it was already late. She walked back to the penthouse, wearing her hat, her head lowered, moving through familiar streets that she now saw with different eyes. When she got home, Sterling was sitting in the living room. He looked up when he heard the door. "Where did you go?" Kira took off her coat and hung it on the rack. "For a walk." Sterling looked at his sister. Longer than usual. Kira didn't look back at him. She walked straight into her room and closed the door. No greeting, no smile, no other words. and Sterling felt it. Not because Kira had said or done anything unusual, but because of the way she didn't look at him. Before, Kira always looked at Sterling when they talked, always waited for him to nod before deciding anything, always searched his eyes for permission. Today, she didn't search. She walked past him, as if walking past an object in the room. Sterling remained in his chair, staring at Kira's closed bedroom door. He didn't know what had changed, but he knew something had cracked. Between the two siblings, between the control he had held so tightly for 3 years, a small fracture had just appeared, and Sterling, for the first time, didn't know how to mend it. The night before the event, Sterling came to Kira's room. He stood in the doorway, watching the makeup team prepare everything for the next day. Then he said, "Tomorrow will be perfect." Kira sat in front of the mirror, her eyes fixed on her own reflection. She didn't answer. The Voss Empire charity auction night. The biggest event of the year. Sterling wasn't holding it only to raise funds. He wanted to introduce Kira as the new brand ambassador for the corporation. Hundreds of guests, all of them among the most powerful faces in Las Vegas. Business people, politicians, celebrities, investors. Live television cameras would record every moment. Everything had to be perfect. And everything did look perfect. The grand hall blazed with light. Kira stepped onto the stage, exactly according to schedule, exactly on time, exactly according to the script. Flawless makeup, confident steps, a smile measured just enough. She stood in the center of the stage, the lights shining down on her, and the whole hall applauded. Sterling sat in the VIP row, the first row, on the right side of the stage. He looked at his sister and smiled, the rare smile of a man who rarely smiled. Everything was going according to plan. In the far back corner of the hall, Marlo stood behind the press barrier, holding her camera. A small magazine she occasionally worked with had assigned her to cover the event. Her name was listed under the magazine's photographers, not under her personal name. Sterling's security team checked her press pass, matched it with the publications list, and didn't verify each individual identity. Marlo got in, legally, validly. She stood in the corner, her lens raised toward the stage, and looked at Kira. Kira on stage, Kira in real life, 2 versions Marlo had seen. Kira began her speech. Her voice was clear, confident, carefully rehearsed. She spoke about Voss Empire's vision, about its commitment to the community, about the meaning of the charity auction that night. Perfect words, smiles in all the right places. The entire hall listened. And then, the lighting changed. No one understood why. There had been no warning, no sign. A stage technician behind the wings had accidentally switched on the UV lighting system, the system installed for the art performance scheduled for 40 minutes later. He pressed it earlier than planned. A technical mistake. One wrong push of a button. That was all. The stage lighting shifted from warm white to black-violet. UV light covered the whole stage. Kira was still speaking, but she stopped in the middle of a sentence, because she looked down at her hands. Under the UV light, the special makeup on her skin glowed, not in a normal way. It glowed unnaturally, with an artificial shimmer, completely different from the skin that had not been covered. The boundary between normal skin and depigmented skin appeared clearly on her face, on her neck, on both arms, like a map drawn in light, exposing every border that money and makeup had hidden for 3 years. Kira looked at her hands. Then she lifted her eyes and looked out at the crowd. Hundreds of faces were staring at her. Hundreds of eyes. And cameras. Live television cameras, lenses still filming, red tally lights still on, recording every second. The hall began to murmur. Whispers spread from one row of seats to another like water spilling over. People looked at one another. People looked up at the stage. People looked at the strange bright lines on Kira's skin and began to understand that something wasn't right. Something had been hidden. Kira stood in the center of the stage, her mouth still open from the unfinished sentence, her eyes lowered to her hands glowing beneath the UV light. She couldn't speak, couldn't move, as if her entire body had frozen in the moment when the greatest secret of her life was stripped bare under the lights. From the VIP row, Sterling moved toward her. He didn't run. Sterling never ran, but he walked fast, faster than anyone had ever seen him move. He took off his suit jacket as he approached, and when he reached Kira, he draped it over her shoulders. His hand closed around Kira's arm, tugging gently, wanting to lead her off the stage. "Come on," Sterling said, his voice low, only loud enough for Kira to hear. Come with me, right now. But Kira didn't go. Sterling's hand held her arm, tugging her gently toward the wings. Kira felt that pull, familiar, like every time he had led her away from a situation, every time he had decided for her, every time he had taken her hand and said, "Come with me," as if she had no right to choose to stay. Kira pushed his hand away, gently, but firmly, like setting down something she had held for far too long. Sterling stopped. His hand remained raised where she had just pushed it away, suspended in the air, as if he couldn't believe what had happened. He looked at Kira. Kira didn't look at him. She looked down at her hands. Under the UV light, the borders on her skin shone clearly. She opened both hands in front of her, looking at each finger, looking at the unusual bright patches where the makeup covered her, and the dark spaces where her real skin wasn't hidden. She looked at them for a long time, not with the fear she'd had just a few minutes earlier. Not with shame either. She looked with the eyes of someone seeing clearly, for the first time, truly seeing clearly, who she was beneath all the layers. Then Kira did something no one in the hall that night could have predicted. She lifted her hand to the collar and took the small handkerchief tucked into the pocket of the suit jacket Sterling had just draped over her shoulders. She raised the handkerchief to her face, and she wiped, slowly, little by little. She wiped away part of the makeup on her right cheek, the thick foundation, the concealer, the special cream the makeup team spent hours applying every day. She wiped it away with a handkerchief, with her own hand. No one forced her. No one asked her to. The UV light couldn't remove makeup. It only exposed the borders. But Kira chose to go further. She chose to take it off herself. When the handkerchief left Kira's face, a large patch of skin on her right cheek and neck was completely exposed beneath the lights. Silvery white, depigmented, with a clear boundary against the normal skin. Not a wound, not a contagious disease, only skin. Real skin. Skin that no one had been allowed to see for 3 years. The hall went silent. There were no more murmurs, no more whispers. Hundreds of people sat motionless, looking up at the stage, looking at the woman standing beneath the violet light, with one half of her face perfect and the other half real. Sterling stood beside Kira, 2 steps away from her. His suit jacket was still on her shoulders. His hands dropped to his sides. And for the first time in the entire life Marlowe knew of him, Sterling Voss didn't know what to do. No lawyer could help him in this moment. No bank, no contract, no system. There was only him, his sister, and the truth an entire empire had done everything to bury, now standing in the middle of the stage beneath the UV lights. Sterling looked at Kira. Kira didn't look back at him. She looked out at the crowd. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. She only stood there, her back straight, the handkerchief still clenched in her hand, and she didn't run. Down in the hall, Marlowe stood behind the press barrier, the camera in her hand, the lens still pointed toward the stage. Her finger rested on the shutter button. She could press it. 1 click, 1 photograph. Kira Voss, the face of Voss Empire, standing in the middle of the stage with her makeup half on and half gone, her skin showing silvery white patches under the UV light. That photograph would land on the front page of every newspaper. It would spread across the internet within hours. It would be a blow Voss Empire would never recover from. Marlowe had the right to take it. She was a press photographer, working, being paid to shoot, and the woman standing on that stage was the sister of the man who had taken her mother from her, taken the bakery, taken everything. She had every reason to press the button. Marlowe lowered the camera. She didn't take the photograph. Not because she was afraid, not because she felt pity. She lowered the camera, and that was all. The act needed no explanation. Sterling saw Marlowe, from the stage, through the black-violet UV light. He looked down toward the back of the hall and saw her, the woman he had fired, threatened, and tried to buy with money. She was standing there, her camera lowered at her side, her eyes looking straight up at the stage. The two of them looked at each other. The distance between them was an entire grand hall, hundreds of people, hundreds of chairs, and 3 years of memory. But in that moment, there were only 2 people looking at each other. Sterling understood. He understood that Marlowe held true power in that moment. 1 photograph, and his empire would crack from the foundation. But she had chosen not to take it. She had chosen to lower the camera. And that choice, somehow, weighed more than any words she had ever spoken to him in the room on the highest floor of the Voss Empire building. On the stage, Kira still stood. Down in the hall, the crowd remained silent. The cameras were still rolling, and no one knew what to do next. Except Kira. She knew. She had already chosen. After that, everything broke open faster than Sterling could control. The security team rushed onto the stage. The UV lights were shut off, and the regular lights came back on, but it was already too late. Hundreds of phones had been raised. Hundreds of screens had recorded it, and the live television cameras had already broadcast everything. Sterling gripped Kira's shoulder and led her through the wings, through the hallway behind the stage, past the faces of staff members standing along the walls in panic. Kira followed him, but not because she wanted to. She was simply tired. Tired in a way she had never been tired before. The kind of tired that came after doing something you had wanted to do for a very long time but had never dared. Sterling took Kira to the car and handed her over to an assistant. "Go back to the penthouse. Wait for me there." Kira didn't answer. She got into the car, the door closed, and the vehicle rolled away. Sterling remained standing in the hallway behind the building, loosening his tie. Around him were hurried footsteps, ringing phones, the sound of someone calling the event manager, but Sterling heard none of it. He only stood there, staring into the empty space in front of him, thinking of one thing: Marlo. She didn't take the photograph. He turned back toward the hall and walked quickly to the press area. The reporters were packing up. Some were calling their newsrooms. Some were reviewing photographs on their cameras. Sterling didn't care about them. He looked around, searching for one face. And then he saw Marlo. She was standing in the corner of the parking garage behind the building, alone, her camera bag over her shoulder, preparing to leave. Sterling walked toward her. Marlo heard the footsteps and turned around. The two of them stood facing each other in the empty parking garage. Pale yellow light from the ceiling shone down over them. No one else was there. Sterling looked at Marlo. Then he asked, "Why didn't you take the photograph?" His voice wasn't cold the way it had been in the office that day, nor was it falsely polite the way it had been when he spoke to Ruth in the room on the highest floor. His voice sounded like the voice of someone who truly wanted to know the answer. Someone who truly didn't understand. Marlo looked at Sterling. She didn't avoid his eyes, didn't fear him, didn't rage at him. She only looked at him, calm, and said, "Because my mother taught me how to bake, not how to destroy other people." Sterling didn't answer. He stood there, looking at Marlo, and said nothing. Not the kind of silence he usually used to control a meeting room. Not the silence of a man calculating his next move. It was the silence of someone who had just heard a sentence he had no ability to answer. Marlo turned away. She walked out of the parking garage without looking back. The sound of her footsteps grew smaller, then disappeared completely. Sterling stood alone. He remained there for a while longer. Then he got into his car. He didn't go back to the penthouse. He drove out of downtown Las Vegas, past the bright avenues, past the blinking billboards, past the buildings he owned or controlled. He drove toward the outskirts, toward the old street. The street no one remembered the name of anymore. Sterling pulled over to the side of the road, turned off the engine, sat in the car with both hands resting on the steering wheel. In front of him was an unfinished construction site. Steel frame, concrete, construction fencing. A Voss Empire sign hung at the corner, his logo, his name. This was where Ruth Kent's bakery had once stood. This was the street where Ruth had once opened her shop every morning, where Marlo had once stood on the front step, taking pictures of passers-by. This was where the recipe book had once rested on the kitchen shelf, where the smell of melting butter had once drifted all the way out to the sidewalk. Now there was only steel and concrete. Sterling sat in the car, looking out. He didn't turn on music, didn't call anyone, didn't do anything at all. He only sat there in the dark, looking at the unfinished construction site he had ordered built. For the first time, he didn't see it as a project, didn't see it as a number on a spreadsheet. He looked at it and wondered what he had built on this ground. He couldn't find an answer. He sat in the car until it was almost morning. Then he started the engine and drove away. Not back to the penthouse, not back to the office. He only drove, with no destination, through the empty streets of Las Vegas at daybreak, when the city hadn't yet had time to wake, and everything was so quiet he could hear himself breathing. By the time Sterling got back to the penthouse, morning had fully arrived. Early sunlight poured through the great panes of glass, falling across the empty living room floor. His assistant stood in the hallway, her face tense. She's been in her room since last night. She hasn't opened the door for anyone. She hasn't eaten anything. Sterling nodded, signaling for the assistant to leave. He walked to Kira's room. The door was shut tight. He stood there for a while, his hand raised, then knocked. 2 soft knocks. Kira. No one answered. Open the door. Silence. Sterling stood before the door, his hand still raised where it had knocked. He wasn't used to having doors closed in his face. Wasn't used to waiting. Wasn't used to this feeling. The feeling of helplessness before a wooden door he could break down with one kick, while knowing that breaking it open wouldn't solve anything. He knocked again. Kira, I need to talk to you. The lock turned. The door opened. Kira stood in the doorway. There was no makeup left on her face. Not because she had just removed it, because she hadn't put it back on. The depigmented patches on her cheek, on her neck, on her arms, all of them were exposed beneath the daylight. Her eyes were red, swollen, but there were no tears left. She had cried enough during the night. Now she was dry and clear. Kira looked at Sterling. He looked back at his sister. And for the first time, he truly saw Kira. Not Kira on the stage. Not Kira at their weekly dinners. Not Kira through foundation and controlled lighting. The real Kira. Standing before him, her eyes red, her skin blotched, and nothing left to hide. He opened his mouth, meaning to speak, but Kira spoke first. You told me I was perfect. Her voice wasn't loud, but every word was clear, heavy, striking Sterling directly without missing by even an inch. You told me, come with me. I can take care of everything. You don't need to worry about that. You told me everything would be fine. You told me tomorrow would be perfect. You made me believe in someone who didn't exist. Sterling stood still. Kira, listen to me. Kira didn't stop. 3 years. For 3 years, you hid me in this apartment. Covered my face layer after layer. Told me how I had to look. How I had to smile. Who I could talk to. Where I could go. What I could wear. You controlled everything. Everything. From my schedule to the lighting, to the camera angles, to the people I was allowed to meet. You said it was protection. But that wasn't protection. It was confinement. You locked me inside an image you built with your own hands, then made me live in it until I forgot who I was. Sterling opened his mouth. I did everything for you. I only wanted. Kira cut him off. What did you want? Did you want to protect me? Or did you want to protect your image? The question landed in the room like something heavy. Sterling didn't answer at once. Because he knew the answer. And that answer was something he didn't want to hear from himself. Kira continued, her voice beginning to tremble. Not because she was afraid, but because she was saying things she had swallowed for too long. And now they were spilling out beyond her control. You were scared. You were scared that if people saw the real me, with this skin, with these white patches, they'd think your empire wasn't perfect either. You were scared people would look at me and see a crack. Because to you, I wasn't your sister. I was part of the brand, an image, a product you wouldn't allow to be defective. Sterling looked at Kira. He wanted to argue. He wanted to say it wasn't like that he loved her, that he cared about her, that he had done all of it for her. But he opened his mouth, and no reason came. Because Kira was right, not entirely right. He did love his sister, but that love had become mixed with the need to control, with the fear of losing the image, with the habit of treating everything around him as variables that needed to be managed. He had loved Kira the way he ran his empire, and that way had turned love into something Kira could no longer tell apart from imprisonment. Sterling swallowed. Then he said, very softly, softer than he had ever spoken in his life, I didn't know another way. Kira looked at him. Her eyes grew wet again, but she didn't cry. She looked at him for a long time, as if looking at someone she had once trusted absolutely, and now she was seeing every crack in the statue she had once believed could never be shaken. Then learn, Kira said, or don't protect anyone anymore. Sterling didn't answer. He stood in the doorway, his hands hanging at his sides, and for the first time, his back bent slightly. Only slightly. No one else would have noticed without looking closely. But it was the first time Sterling Voss's body wasn't straight, the first time the posture he carried into every room, every meeting, every confrontation, had bowed under something. Not because someone had struck him, but because his sister had told the truth. Kira stepped back into her room. She didn't slam the door. She closed it gently. The sound of the door shutting was very small, but inside the wide, empty penthouse, it echoed like something had just ended. Sterling stood before the closed door. He remained there for a few more seconds. Then he turned away and walked off, down the hallway, through the living room, out the front door, without looking back, without saying another word. His footsteps echoed across the polished stone floor, steady, slow, and each step sounded heavier than the one before. A few weeks passed. Sterling didn't appear at any events. No press conferences, no meetings with partners, no interviews. His phone still worked, but he didn't answer it. Emails still arrived, but he didn't open them. Outside, the media was still buzzing about the auction night, about Kira, about the makeup beneath the UV light. But Sterling didn't read any of it. He knew what they were writing without needing to read it. He sat in his office, alone, the curtains drawn shut, the main lights off, with only the weak glow from the desk lamp. On his desk were still the project files, the contracts waiting to be signed, the financial reports, but he didn't touch them. He sat there, looking at them, as if looking at things that belonged to someone else. During those few weeks, he didn't see Kira. She was still in the penthouse, but the door to her room remained closed. He didn't knock. She didn't open it. The two siblings lived in the same apartment, without seeing each other, like two strangers sharing the same address. Sterling didn't know what Kira was doing in her room. He didn't ask the assistant. He didn't check the security cameras. For the first time in 3 years, he didn't control. Not because he had chosen to let go, but because he no longer knew what to hold on to. One morning, Sterling stood, put on his suit jacket, and left the office. He drove to an address he had never gone to by himself before, the private legal office of Voss Empire. He walked in, sat down across from the chief lawyer, and said, "Stop the entire project on Kent Street." The lawyer looked at him, thinking he must have heard wrong. "Which street, sir?" "The street we cleared 3 years ago. The Eastern Entertainment Project. Stop it. All of it." The lawyer opened his computer and pulled up the project file. He looked at the numbers, then looked at Sterling. "This project has already taken more than $20 million. There are 3 active partner contracts. If we stop now, we'll lose deposits, pay contract penalties, and lose at least 2 major partners. Not to mention credibility." "I know," Sterling said, "and return the property to the former owner." The lawyer was silent for a few seconds. "The former owner is deceased, sir. Then return it to the heir." Sterling stood. He didn't explain further, didn't give a reason, didn't say this was because of Kira, because of Marlowe, because of Ruth Kent, or because of the night he had sat in his car looking at the unfinished construction site. He only gave the order, and Sterling Voss didn't need to explain his orders. He left the lawyer's office and got into his car. His phone vibrated. The number belonged to one of his biggest partners. He answered. On the other end, the voice was tense. "I heard you're planning to stop the Eastern project. You know that if you stop, they won't let this go. The partners on the other side have already advanced the money and signed the papers. You can't back out unilaterally without paying a price." Sterling looked out through the car window. "I know." Then he hung up. In the weeks that followed, the price came. Fast, clear, non-negotiable. 2 partners pulled their capital out of other Voss Empire projects. A major contract with a hotel group was cancelled. Some people in the industry began saying that Sterling was losing control, that the auction night had shaken him, that the Voss Empire had a crack in it. Sterling heard the rumors. He didn't deny them, didn't explain himself, didn't strike back. He only continued sitting in his office, handling each consequence, each contract, each number, silent, alone. He paid the price, and he knew he was paying it. But for the first time, that price wasn't on a spreadsheet. It was somewhere else, somewhere he had only just begun to know existed. One afternoon, an envelope was delivered to Marlowe's apartment. There was no sender's name, only the name of a law firm. Inside was a set of legal documents. Marlowe opened it and read each page. Then she stopped at the final page, transfer of property use rights. The address written on the document was the old street, the place where Ruth's bakery had once stood. The property was being returned to the legal heir. The name on the document was Marlowe Kent. She held the papers, standing in the middle of her small apartment, and read that address again. The street no one remembered the name of anymore. But Marlowe remembered. Kira appeared in public for the first time since the auction night on a quiet morning. Not on a grand stage, not in a luxurious hall, just a small interview, one chair, one table, and one camera. She sat down, her back straight, her hands resting on her lap. No makeup. The depigmented patches on her cheek, on her neck, on her arms, were clearly visible beneath the studio lights. She didn't cover them, didn't hide them, and the outfit she wore wasn't designer fashion. It was the outfit she had designed herself. From the pencil sketches in her drawer, from the nights she had sat drawing alone when no one was watching. Now they were here, on her body, in front of the lens. Kira looked into the camera, and she said, "I don't apologize for my skin. I didn't choose it. But it's part of me, and I don't apologize for being myself. What I do apologize for is the way I treated the people around me. When I thought I was perfect, I looked down on others. When I believed in the image people had built for me, I forgot that everyone deserves respect. I was wrong." She stopped and took a breath. "I lived with a face someone else put on me. Today is the first day I'm going outside with my own face." A few months later, the old street. The street no one remembered the name of anymore, but this morning, someone remembered. The unfinished construction site had been taken apart. The construction fence had been removed. The Voss Empire sign was gone, and in the middle of the street, a small bakery had just opened its doors. The sign hung above the doorway. A simple wooden board, hand-painted, with 2 words. Ruth's. Inside the bakery, the smell of melting butter drifted from the kitchen to the counter. From the counter, out to the sidewalk. That was a smell this street had once known. Many years ago. Now it had returned. Marlowe stood behind the counter, her hair tied high, her apron fastened around her waist. In front of her, on the wooden kitchen table, Ruth's recipe book lay open. Yellowed pages, slightly slanted handwriting. The edges of the book curled from years of use. The book had once rested on the shelf of the old bakery, had once rested at Ruth's bedside, had once lain in the drawer Marlowe didn't dare open, had once lain in the trash. Now it was here, on the kitchen table, open, exactly where it belonged. Marlowe kneaded the dough. Her hands pressed down, folded over, pressed down, folded over. The old rhythm, the rhythm she thought she had forgotten, but her hands hadn't. The doorbell rang. Marlowe looked up. Kira stepped in. No makeup on her face. The depigmented patches on her cheek and neck were clearly visible beneath the sunlight shining through the glass door. She wore a simple outfit, designed by herself, soft in shape, pale in color. Kira looked around the bakery, at the counter, at the sign, then at Marlowe. The 2 women looked at each other. No one spoke of the auction night. No one spoke of Sterling. No one spoke of what had been lost and what had been paid back. Kira walked to the counter. "I'll have 1 butter sugar cookie." Marlowe nodded. She took a cookie from the tray that had just come out of the oven, placed it on a plate, and pushed it across the counter. Kira took the plate and sat down at the small table beside the window. She broke the cookie and ate slowly. Morning sunlight passed through the glass, falling across the table, across the plate, across Kira's hands. The smell of butter and sugar. Warm sunlight, the occasional ringing of the doorbell when a new customer came in, and 2 women, one standing behind the counter, one sitting beside the window, together inside a small bakery on the street whose name people would now remember again. At the same time, on the highest floor of the penthouse on the other side of the city, Sterling stood on the balcony. The morning wind blew softly. He looked out at the Las Vegas skyline, at the buildings he owned, the streets he controlled. The phone in his pocket vibrated. He took it out. A message from Kira. No words. Only 1 photograph. A photograph of the bakery sign. Ruth's. Behind the sign, through the glass door, Marlowe could be seen faintly standing behind the counter. And sunlight. So much sunlight. Sterling looked at the photograph. For a long time, his thumb rested on the screen, nearly touching the sign in the picture. Then he turned off the phone, put it in his pocket, turned around and walked back inside. The balcony door closed behind him. He didn't go to the bakery. Not because he didn't want to, but because he knew there were places he no longer had the right to enter. There were things he had taken away, and even after giving them back, he no longer had the right to stand beside them. And perhaps that was the most expensive lesson Sterling Voss had ever learned. Not everything lost can be bought back. Not every wound heals simply because we want it to. And loving someone in our own way doesn't mean that person will feel loved. Sometimes, real love means letting someone live as the person they choose to be, even when that means you have to stand at a distance and watch. This story ends here, but perhaps, in your heart, it hasn't ended yet. If this story touched you, please press the like button so more people can hear it. Share it with someone you think needs to listen. And please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next stories every day. We'd love to know how you felt after this story. Which part made you stop and think? Which character touched you the most? Please share with us in the comments, because every comment you write is another story, from deep within your heart. And we're always listening. Thank you for staying until the end of the story. We wish you and your loved ones good health, happiness in life, and peace every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.